Okay, welcome everybody to this third webinar we have on the Open Science Ambassador training here at Eurodoc. I'd just like to say hello to all of our ambassadors that are getting the training. We have Barend Mons in the studio with us today, and he's going to talk about open and fair data. Before that, I'm going to give a brief introduction to open science, what exactly that is, and what we're doing at Eurodoc on that, and then we'll hear more from Barend. So, Eurodoc, this is a non-profit organization based in Brussels for the last 16 years, legally in any case, and we represent 29 national associations of doctoral candidates and postdoctoral researchers across Europe. So basically, we represent a large majority of the early career researcher population. It's fully funded by them, by our members, and completely organized also by our members who are volunteers. And basically what we do is make policy within our working groups and in events and in our mailing list with early career researchers and with our national associations. There's three main topics for early career researchers that we find important right now. The first one is basically career development for early career researchers, especially looking at the non-academic labor market. We know that most of them must leave, but they're not being trained or skilled to do this. The second one is the rising issues we see in academia related to mental health and increasing work stress, anxiety, and depression even. And this is related, of course, to the academic environment, but also the increasing workload and the uncertainty in future careers in many cases. And the final topic that we find very important is open science. So what exactly is open science? How do we do it? And how does that work? Okay, so Eurodoc basically is following policy on the European level, and the European Commission came out in 2016 with a policy initiative linking to open science. Now, we had been doing open science for at least 400 years already, but this was framing it in a more narrow perspective. So for the European Commission, open science is basically opening up our research using digital tools. Then this is linked to what's called open innovation, so how we include more stakeholders in this innovation process, including industry or other societal actors, and that this should lead to what we call open to the world. So how we give our results, how we give our data, how we give our services and products to not just our partners in Europe, but also outside Europe, and how we get them more involved in European affairs. Now, what do we mean exactly by open science? This is a complicated issue. Open science is basically an umbrella of different practices, but in many cases it will refer to open access to research publications or open access to data and many other issues such as citizen science or open education or even open licensing. Why do we do open science? Well, this basically opens up access to our research, and for the researchers it increases their discoverability. It also increases their own impact in academia, but also in society. More practically, it helps to facilitate and reproduce research, and for institutions or researchers with limited resources, it helps to share and save these resources and pool them, and ultimately this speeds up innovation. And just note, which I'm sure we'll hear from Barend later, that when we say open, we don't just mean a black and white spectrum of open or closed, but we mean a gradient spectrum of to be as open as possible. So things can be opened up as we go along, and they can be opened up to certain degrees. Final point I'd like to make is that Eurodoc fully does support open science. We've been doing this for many years. And what we find crucial, especially towards our stakeholders, is that researchers are trained, are supported, and are ultimately rewarded in research evaluation and career progression at their institutions. Okay, I'm going to switch back now. I'm going to go to Barend. I'm going to say welcome and thank you for joining us. Barend is a professor in Leiden in human genetics. He is also the president of CoData, and he is also leading the Go Fair initiative. So Barend, maybe you can say a bit more about that, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Gareth. Yes, indeed, in my daily life, I'm a professor in human genetics, where we deal with enormous amounts of data. We actually double the amount of data every 6 months in human genetics. So that's an amazing amount of data. So I think the reason that I became involved in FAIR data is that our field, next to astronomy, where the data are much more uniform, hits the problems with data stewardship and how to reuse data like in almost no other discipline. So that's my biological background. But then we started this FAIR Data initiative in 2014 and a meeting here in Leiden where we were with 40 international people that also wrote the article on FAIR. And we formulated the FAIR principles, which were taken up with very high speed by the politicians because they are principles, not a standard. And nobody can be against findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable stuff. So that led to my chairmanship of the high-level expert group of the European Open Science Cloud, and then to president of CoData. So we are now seeing that the FAIR principles are going all over the world. And one of the downsides of such an acronym that sticks to people's minds is that it's, according to Mark Hanel, the CEO of Figshare, he said it's one of the, my favorite word of 2018, but also the most abused word. So I think what I would like to start with is to introduce the FAIR principles very briefly to you, and then focus on how they change completely the way we can do science on the web. So the slide that is here now, you see a number 31 at the bottom. It's from a much larger presentation that was given this January to the World Economic Forum that you see on the right-hand side on the FAIR principles and to use them in healthcare. And I have highlighted two things here to explain two major misconceptions about FAIR. It's not that anything that can be found and is accessible and you can read it if you read English and therefore it's free to reuse is suddenly FAIR. FAIR really is for human and computer systems. I would rather turn it around for, if I would have made this slide myself, computer systems and also humans. Because with this enormous amount of data we create, the only way we can efficiently discover patterns in those data is with the help of machines. So we better make our data machine readable. And I have another presentation with the 7 capital sins of open science. The entire communication system of science is a nightmare for machines. We publish a narrative with supplementary data somewhere hidden behind an article. Right now, it is almost impossible for machines to find data if they are even in machine readable format. So the data should be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable for machines, first of all. Then they are also better understandable for people after translation into human readable format. And the other thing that I wanted to highlight here is that accessible and fair is not the same as open. The A stands for accessible under well-defined conditions. And we have already about 7 licenses that people can give to their data. And even those licenses should be machine readable. So the machine knows what it is allowed to do with certain data when it encounters them. This could be, for example, you can use them for academic purposes, but not for commercial purposes. So fair is not the same as open, and it is mostly for machines. Now, when I gave this presentation some time ago, I called it the end of data sharing as we know it. Because let me first go into some term bashing. When you say data sharing to most people, especially older scientists, they think I send my data to someone else, I lose control, and they can do stuff with it that I don't like. That could range from not citing me to drawing crazy conclusions on my data. And so we can find all kinds of reasons not to share data. And scientists are clever, they find them. But then we go to data visiting and we create the internet for social machines standing for a seamless interaction between human brains and machines. So the machines do the hard work for us, the pattern recognition, come up with hypotheses, but in the end, people will decide whether there is actionable knowledge there and apply it. So again, data sharing does no longer mean I send my data around, and I'll come back to that in more detail later. So when I was the chair of the European Open Science Cloud, one of the other term bashings I did with the then Director General, Robert Jan Smits, and I said, I hate all 4 terms. Because European could suggest that science stops at the European borders. Of course not, it's global. Open means to many researchers free. And even if stuff is completely open and data would be completely open and the workflows that we use are completely open, which we need for open science, somebody still pays for it. And it's horribly expensive to keep petabytes of data open and available. So somebody has to pay. And really a connotation of the term open in many minds of scientists is free. Then, of course, it's not only for science. Gareth already said that. We also need to use this for innovation and actual societal innovation. And of course, when you say cloud, people think Amazon. That's not what it is. It is a trusted environment where scientists in the whole world, so we now look for the Internet of Fair Data and Services, can reuse each other's workflows and data for faster science. Now, the next term I would like to bash, and I use this slide for it, is that first of all, especially the European Commission now seems to think that FAIR solves everything. It's a panacea. So now they even think that they can reconcile the problems with GDPR, the privacy, fake news. They invite me for all kinds of things here. And I keep saying, first of all, I don't believe artificial intelligence already exists. It's an advanced form of machine learning, and my own research, as I will show later in a few minutes, is very close to artificial intelligence, but I wouldn't even call the most advanced research we do on this as artificial intelligence. So I usually show this slide now that I just got from Twitter, the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence. If it's written in Python, it's probably machine learning. If it's written in PowerPoint, it's probably AI. In other words, everybody talks about AI, nobody does it because it simply doesn't exist yet. So where are we in science? And this is the Internet of Fair Data and Services. In the new way of doing web-based and internet-based global science, there is 3 major elements. You have the data, and they are somewhere. You have the tools, the workflows that you need to deal with the data and to derive patterns from it and ultimately, of course, knowledge. And of course, at that same point in the internet, you need enough compute to actually do what you need to do. Now, this could be all on one smartphone, the data, the algorithm, and the compute. And don't mind, most of your smartphones are now more powerful than the entire compute of the Apollo 13 when it landed on the moon. So you could imagine that the supercomputer of the future is 8 billion smartphones. But the data are frequently in the petabytes now, and that will soon be yottabytes of single data sets, like all human genomes of all citizens of Europe. Now, first of all, you don't need all the data for many cases. They are too large to transmit. If you now transmit a petabyte of data through the internet, that's horribly expensive and slow. And in many cases, like in my own case in our hospital here, we are not even allowed to send our data somewhere else because they are sensitive patient data. So what you will see more and more happening, and that's what you see in the center of this picture, which is from the front of my book on data stewardship, that the tools, which are usually workflows, virtual machines, they are in the megabytes or gigabytes, very small. They travel to the data. So we go to what we call distributed learning, where virtual machines visit a large number of smaller and larger data sets with a certain knowledge model to learn on, and they ask permission, they visit the data, and they run their analyses, they accumulate the results, and they finally answer all the questions that we used to answer by pulling all the data together in a huge data warehouse and then run some stupid old-fashioned queries on them. So what you will see happening in the near future is distributed learning by virtual machines in data lakes and structured and unstructured data that are all over the world in graphic format, in graph format. And as long as the virtual machines understand these fair data graphs, they will learn any knowledge you want from them and then accumulate the data into the result. And what you will see then is that the text on the top of this slide just reminds me to say that I published already in 2005 that we needed machine readable data, and it took 13 years to convince the world. And I said, you know, if you publish traditionally in papers, you bury it first, and then you have to mine it again to get it back into machine readable format. While in your head, you already had some like subject predicate object connections, like my old love, malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, can be very easily said in a machine readable language. So when we go to the center of this slide, when you have more machines, you go from conventional computation to big data and, you know, pattern recognition, big compute. You have more people, you have to need social networking. We now see papers in Nature with 8,000 authors, which already shows the thing becomes too complex for individual researchers to work. And social machines are the ultimate way where lots of people can access lots of pre-analyzed data by machines, and they can analyze them. And the final thing of the term bashing part, before we go to more interesting stuff, is really that the big data are not the issue. If you want to cross disciplines, so for example, you want genetics data, Facebook data, and weather data to see whether people get depressed in spring or not, then you will encounter a lot more problems than when you just go to twice as many data in the same discipline, because people use different ontologies and different vocabularies and methods and machines in different disciplines, and they are totally non-interoperable. 85% of the data today is either not interoperable for others, or they simply disappear with the PhD student that leaves and took his laptop. So that's not data stewardship. So to tackle all these problems, we started GoFair. And as I said, we had a meeting in 2014 in Leiden to make this, to do it theoretically. Then EOSC and a pre-proposal verdict was going on. And then GoFair is global open fair, where we have already 30 implementation networks from GBIF to the CData Cloud to many others that say we want to work together to reuse each other's tools and to agree on a sort of equivalent of TCP/IP in the current internet as we know it, where we, as long as you stick to TCP/IP and domain names, you have a maximum freedom to operate. That's the hourglass model to build your applications. So we also strongly believe that the EOSC, but also the Global Internet of Fair Data and Services, is nothing else than this propeller on the right-hand side, the Internet of Fair Data and Services, where everyone that sticks to minimal interoperability standards and ontologies can make their data and their workflows interoperable. So a little bit of technology then. What you see is that if you communicate in science a concept, like, for example, we took the example cancer here that you see on the left-hand side. You can say cancer, malignant neoplasms. In German, you would say Krebskrankheit. In the Unified Medical Language System, it's CO265 stands for cancer. So we have lots of tokens, including unique identifiers, that refer to the unique concept cancer. Now, what we need in the Internet of Fair Data and Services for FAIR is a unique, persistent, resolvable identifier. I call this a UPRI for every concept. Now, that sounds like a challenge, but I'll try and tell you it's not. Not such a big challenge. So then in the people's mind, you evoke the concept based on a token. And if you speak German, you know exactly what Krebskrankheit means. But if you're an English speaker, an American, you wouldn't know. So then, of course, on the other angle of this semiotic or octant triangle, there is the actual object. But of course, there's many concepts that do not have a real object. Even a single molecule of insulin or cancer, it's a concept that doesn't have, it have lots of instances like a real cancer or a tumor, but a concept like love or trust doesn't have a measurable entity. So we as humans communicate in concepts, okay? And now if you write down in a certain language or narrative, you exclude all other sources that, including machines, that will want to know what you mean by cancer. So for machines, you need a unique identifier like HTTP, GoFair, and then a unique universal identifier for the concept cancer. That also solves all kinds of synonym and homonym problems. Just one example, PSA, prostate-specific antigen. Person that loves cars would think Citroën Peugeot. That acronym as a token has 189 different meanings in Medline alone, so the computer gets completely confused. But if you use a unique identifier, it knows what you mean. Now, we call that everything in the Internet of data and services, fair data and services, is a digital object. That's a bit sequence. It could be a single identifier or a triple or an entire database. It needs metadata. It needs operational instructions and a persistent identifier itself. So if we build the internet very much like this, then machines will be able to understand not only what the digital object is, but also what the machine is able to do with it and what it is allowed to do with it. Okay, so that is the basis, the basic small element, could be as small as a single identifier for a concept that builds the internet. Now we go to the next step, and this is what we call a nano publication. That's the simplest statement, subject, predicate, object. And let's take the example. Malaria is the green ball. Transmission, well-defined predicate, is the yellow ball. And object is the red ball. Malaria transmitted by mosquitoes. That statement can be three digital objects, subject, predicate, object, but in itself, it's a new digital object with its own unique identifier, and it needs provenance, very much like a scientific article, author, time date stamp. So this is the smallest possible publication you can imagine, okay? Then, if you connect all these connections, all these assertions, you can make a graph. And of course, knowledge discovery, as we do it in science, is focusing on the thing with the dotted line around us. How can we find connections between assertions and between digital objects that were never connected before? So I show you a little bit of the daunting complexity of my own field, but you can translate it to your own field. So if we take a nano publication, as I said, as the smallest possible communication unit of knowledge, then you can, of course, have two nano publications. That's in B here. So this nano publication has the same subject, the same predicate, the same object. So it's again somebody who says malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes. Now, the only thing that differs is the provenance, because it's a different person at a different time who made the same assertion. And I can tell you that in Medline alone, this particular cardinal assertion, as we call it under C, has been done already more than 8,000 times. And you see this more than 100,000 times in the web. So many people have in text, malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and then they start their article. The computer needs that only once. So think about it. If we estimate how many nano publications we have in the entire explicitome, as we call it, in the life sciences, our estimate is 10 to the 14th. There is no machine that can deal with that. However, on average, the redundancy, so the number of times a particular statement has been made, is 1,000. So we reduce to a 10 to the 11th cardinal assertions. That's already manageable for a very expensive computer. And you can easily find that because the computer will recognize the same subject, predicate, object identifiers very efficiently and collapse them all into one. So companies are doing this now and so on to reduce the concept space. But now comes the real trick. If I now take these cardinal assertions and I say, now look at the colors in CA1, CA2, CA3, CA4 in the middle, you see that the predicate and the objects are different. So you could say malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, malaria is transmitted also by syringe, malaria can be treated by chloroquine, and so on. So everything that is ever said about the subject malaria, which is a unique identifier now, can be collapsed into one noded, which is a new larger digital object. So it has its own UPRI, unique identifier, and its own provenance. So you know when this noded was created, and this can change over time. And to your surprise, let me tell you that the number of nodeds, so the number of concepts we publish about in science, in life sciences, is less than 1 million. And if I take all these nodeds, they fit on my laptop. So I can now store all the assertions we have ever made, if I take out the redundancy and I cluster them by concept, on my laptop. Okay? And now we can look at the similarity of these nodeds, and we start to see connections between genes and proteins. And here you see just one example. And don't try to follow all the science if you're not a life scientist. But I just show you we integrated, not integrated, but we connected a pathology atlas, a big Phantom 5 database, and many others. And we asked very complicated questions that would normally take a long time to answer. And that is, how many disease-causing variants in the genome do not map to genes, but map to a transcription start site, that's where the gene starts. And the computer gives you the answer in 1 second. It says 30% or 20% of the known disease-causing variants map to a transcription start site. The other thing you can do is here, I'm almost done. This is a company, and we said, okay, there is this big epidemic coming in the United States that all people that have metabolic syndrome and have a strong overweight have diabetes. They have a tendency to develop early onset Alzheimer, which would be a disaster, of course. And the computer tells you in the center, you see the circle, immediately which 5 genes you have to study that have to do with all these diseases. And this already led to some links on how this could work. So finally, what you can do now in the computer is you can look at near sameness. That's under B. So A says you can look at conceptual similarity and do hypothesis generation. This could also treat criminals that never call each other, but they have a lot of overlap. So you can do this for CIA type purposes. Then you can look at near similarity. So a human gene is almost the same as a mouse gene, for example. You can see that these nodeds have semantic drift. Imagine the noded of Donald Trump after he was elected president, how his noded would move when you would store everything that is said about Donald Trump. But also, if 5 million people say he's a criminal, that only is one cardinal assertion with 1 million provenances. And then we can also do quas. You can filter out from these nodeds anything that's older than a certain date, that's a time date stamp, and so on. So you can look at quas, as we call it, look at Romario, qua football player, or qua politician, for example. So coming to the final example, here's a patient that is a real patient that has his thyroid gland removed, and he then got 2 years later COPD. He collected all his own data. He is a computer scientist from Ordina, and he found by sending around a virtual machine that there is 169,000 patients with the same problem. The doctors say no, PubMed says no, but if he goes to the graph in Eurythos at the left, normally this is animated, but that didn't work here. You see that there is a hypothesis coming and says, okay, here's a gene, protein that you should really check, that went down in his blood, and now he's checking whether all these patients have the same problem. So the machine generates a hypothesis for him based on this knowledge structure, and he finds out whether he can now prove that hypothesis completely by distributed learning. And that is what we have FAIR data for, and that is what GoFair stands for, to help people to come in, make their own data fair, and bring your own data hackathons. And we see that the funders are now more and more requiring this to happen. Let's stop here because Gareth wanted time for questions. Maybe just put up this last slide here. I really believe that very soon all the funders, starting by B on the right-hand bottom side, will require a data stewardship plan that should be approved when you get your grant. When your grant is approved, you can only spend, let's say, the 5% or so that you have in your data stewardship plan with certified providers. And that's the other thing that you see happening now, that providers will require now, and funders also, that you produce FAIR data, which again is not the same as open. So over to Gareth.
Thank you, Barend. I'll get you to switch back to your screen so we can have a look at you. So I see a lot of questions coming in, and I'm going to start with just a couple of clarification questions. Yeah.
See me now?
Give it 1 second. Not yet. I think there's a stop presenting option.
I have to press stop sharing. Okay.
Yeah. Yes, you're in. We can see you. So one of the questions, well, first question to get this very clear here is, what is then for you the difference between open data and fair data? Because if we've understood this correctly, you make your data fair, and in principle, it does not necessarily have to be open, the whole data set, right?
Oh. So in principle, all data should be fair, but not all data can be open. So open data are a subset of fair data in the ideal situation. That's clear. But even we go a lot further, because coming back to this Nano Publication idea, if I store, let's say, all the variants in my genome in a personal locker, I can give every single assertion at this position in my genome, there is this mutation, a separate license. So I can even say, if my doctor comes into my locker, he can see all my variations, all my mutants, but not this one that makes me prone to schizophrenia or whatever. Mm-hmm. So every single data element in every data set has a license associated, which is just another identifier, an identifier pointing to a machine readable license. So if my machine comes into data, it knows exactly what it has to do to be authorized to do exactly what with that data. And therefore, data, for example, in the pharma, can be closed, but fair in format. And now their data start to talk to all other public data, which gives them a huge advantage, but it doesn't tell them necessarily to open up their data. So data can be fair and not open, and data can also be open and completely reuseless because they are not fair, and the machine cannot even use them. So open is really a dangerous term. And again, coming back to the early point in my presentation, is that many people think, oh, open data are free. To keep a petabyte of data for open research for others is a huge cost. You know, about a petabyte is about 250,000 per year to keep it up and running for other people. So are you going to ask researchers that produce a petabyte of data to make them open? No, they could have them fair on tape or in DNA, And if people need them, they will have to pay for uploading them into their environment. That's not the same as open, you know? So open is, in that sense, a very dangerous term to use, also as an ambassador, because people have very strange connotations with the term open. And they also say it's morally better. No, sometimes it's morally very bad to publish data. Give you one example. Naturalis is around the corner here. If they publish the location of the last specimen of a rare plant, it will be picked by some idiot the same day. And it's over. So they will never publish the data. It will be unethical to publish that data because it will kill the last specimen of that species. So there could be very good reasons not to make data open.
Yeah. So if I understand this correctly, then so open, there's a set of different concepts linked to this. One of them you've mentioned is whether that's free or not, as in financially, and the cost involved. Number two is the time that the data may be opened. It could be immediate or it could be phased. And number three is, in a way, the access, how much of the data you are able to see to some extent. Yeah. And then fair is slightly different. Then fair is how you open up details about your data set, what is in there, that I can find it somewhere, and then I can apply, for instance, for access, whether I pay or not, and to what extent I get in.
Exactly. And also, you know, for what purpose? So you could easily have a license saying this data can be used free for academics, but they cannot be used for academic purposes. It's very comparable to open source licenses in software. You know, you have dual licensing where you can download software for non-commercial purposes, and then you have this dual license that if you extend on the software, you have to give back the extension. So you could say, if you publish based on my data, your data have to be entirely open again. If you don't want that, as pharma, you have to pay. Well, that's fine. Yep. Farmers that collect a lot of data with John Deere trackers and with their drones, they will sell their data to Bayer Crop Sciences. Why not? So there is, you can do data trading. So the A stands for accessible under well-defined conditions. And finally, the pharma, for example, when I was in the pharma project of IMI, Innovative Medicines Initiative, some years ago, I learned that the pharma will not touch your data if they don't have a license. So even if you are this free-floating scientist, you don't care, you say, oh, of course, my data is open for everyone, so I don't even bother to put a license on it, that means they will not be reused by the pharma, because they will be sued afterwards.
Yeah.
There's entire companies that have a business model sue the pharma. You know?
So, and to make this clear then, so minimally you should be making your data fair, and then you can take the next step as in how much you open that data.
And you could also say, there is an embargo of 6 months, and then I will relax my accessibility. So you decide, and that's the very important thing. Also, for example, for Africa, when I went there to start the Open Science Cloud for Africa, they said, oh, no, 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 no. We're not going to send our data to the United States, especially not now. But hey, if virtual machines from Europe and from the United States visit data that are physically in our own servers, and we decide the access protocol, hey, now we are in.
Yep. I'm going to hit you up with a few questions. I can see quite a lot of them coming in. So number one is, could you explain for non-experts what makes data machine readable? And how can I ensure that my data fulfills this criterion? That might even tie in with specific formats.
Yeah, so there is a number of machine readable formats. One of them is RDF, the Resource Description Framework. But the essence is, for FAIR, I always say, the machine knows what I mean. Okay, so that means if you go back in your mind to this picture of the digital object with the orange colors, the machine encounters a concept, a meaningful thing, could be an identifier. First of all, it should know what it means. Is it resolvable to the concept cancer in this case? You know? The second thing the machine should know to make it machine actionable is how does cancer relate to, it is a disease. That's triple already. And then if you have a larger digital object like a data set, the machine needs to know in the metadata. So FAIR is all, if you read the paper, you can all read the paper. It's all about mostly metadata. So a picture, for example, cannot be fair. Machines don't understand pictures. Okay, we have machine recognition, but the annotations of the picture saying this is bone marrow and there is this black dot there, which is a cancer cell, you know, that's an annotation. And that could be in machine readable format because you use ontologies to say cancer, to say cell, to say, you know, this is bone marrow. Now, the instructions should also be machine readable, but it all comes down to using unambiguous identifiers for concepts and how they relate. That's also the basis of linked data, of course, and that's incredibly powerful because machines are much better to reason over billions of nodes in such a graph in a split second than we are. And then they reveal patterns in those machine readable data. So metadata, rich machine readable metadata are key to FAIR.
Okay, and I see questions coming in on the concepts. I will come back to that in one moment. What is the most difficult data for machine learning right now regarding research data?
Probably, well, first of all, data that is not fair, which is, we call it reuseless. But I think that the data that are most difficult to make machine readable are data that are vague. So in the social sciences, you may have all kinds of vague concepts that maybe relate and hatch statements around it. That leads me to another answer. I'm not advocating we should abandon narrative, but also to upset publishers, especially, you know, the old-fashioned publishers, I say, you know, we have to switch now to publishing machine-readable data with a supplementary article to explain also to people why you did draw conclusions. So very complicated rhetoric in the social sciences is the most difficult to capture in machine-readable format. And therefore, we should only capture in machine-readable format which can be captured and keep narrative for reasoning, for humans, human reasoning and rhetorics and so on, and hedge statements. But if you, I always turn this triple question around, and maybe people could read my article, The Value of Data. If you cannot formulate your scientific assertion, your conclusion, in a triple format, it's not a valid conclusion. Because it's a vague, maybe, whatever. That's not science. So if you really want to conclude something based on very complex things, and you're unable to express it in, for example, RDF, then probably you have not made a right conclusion anyway, because it's not understandable for a simple mind or a simple machine.
And just to be clear, when we talk about fair data, we can make a distinction between fair data as in of the object, the digital object, and fair metadata describing the digital object. Are they two different things?
Yes. Well, technically, metadata are data as well, but metadata separate from raw data as they describe data. And then you have, even to make it more complicated, we are now dealing with probably 6 levels of metadata, because you can also say these metadata were made by the original author, and then later on people reuse the data set. They come up with annotations of the data set. We call them machine readable, user-defined metadata. Again, machine readable assertions about don't use this data with this workflow because in column 4 there is a mistake and the workflow will crash. That's metadata as well. So we are dealing with different levels of metadata, and many of the research questions computers will answer in the coming years may even be answerable purely based on metadata rather than going back to the original data. So metadata, in the prediction of George Strawn, who started the internet and who's very much with us, he's 80 now, he said, in the internet of fair data and services, metadata will become the most important asset, even more important than the original data.
So this opens up a really, I guess, thorny issue, which I was going to come to later, but I'll do it now. So how can we guarantee that the data is indeed correct reproducible, trustworthy? If you're implying that we fall back on the metadata, and who acts as that gatekeeper?
Yeah, well, the point is here, that is a very pertinent question that I deliberately never address in my keynotes, because then I know I will get the question, and that's very nice. Because people used to say, oh, quality, quality, quality. Now, first of all, I said, are you going to judge the quality of a petabyte of data? So people even this week, the Germans said, we need fair Q. We need to add letters to the acronym. Now, first of all, you disturb the acronym. But secondly, FAIR does not say one thing about quality of data. We had Huub Stapel here, the psychologist who made up all his data for years and had several Nature papers. So that was already possible in the old system. So you could make completely fake data, make them fully fair, machine readable and accessible, and of course they should not be reused, but but actually we create fake data ourselves, because what we do when the virtual machines come in and they promise to do a certain algorithm, we first give them fake data, and then we know what should come out of their algorithm. And if the outcome is different, we say, hey, you're not doing what you promised. So sometimes fake data is even useful. But anyway, the only way to judge the quality of data over the long run is to allow people to reuse them and make comments on them. Say, oh, this is a lousy data set, which is true for lots of data sets, by the way. And I think so my answer is always provenance, very detailed information of how the data were created, which machine was used to measure them, what is the sensor, who is the author. It's very much the same as you do in reading papers. You say, okay, they may be peer reviewed. We know that peer review is the most lousy system, especially closed peer review. So we have deliberately shown years ago, you can get the bare nonsense into peer-reviewed papers. We did it deliberately. So what you will never be sure, and the reuse of the data will deliver a lot of information. The computer says, this cannot be true because, it doesn't fit with 99% of my other data. So I would say that Huub Stapel, the famous guy that made up all his data, would be unmasked. If we would have fair data, he would never have been able to survive. Of course, he was unmasked at the end, but fair data would have said, the machine would have said, it doesn't fit with common knowledge. So it's either a big discovery or the guy is faking. Now, in this case, he was faking.
Okay, yeah, that sounds clear. So, I mean, fair data, in a way, it helps you access this and possibly do reproducibility studies, maybe even analyze the data that's coming out of it.
Yes, and fair is as such does not, and very deliberately, we have spent hours discussing that, very deliberately, fair does not say a word about the actual quality of the data that are fair. It's about the format and the accessibility of the data.
Okay, and just to be clear here, we were talking about how journals, in a way, act as a gatekeeper for what is considered good science. Are you suggesting then that we use FAIR in a way to peer review data and possibly even reward researchers then for, number one, opening data, number two, peer reviewing data?
Well, peer reviewing, as I said, you cannot peer review in the classical sense, read through a petabyte of data. But what you do is you publish your data, and that's sin number 5, I'll send you my 7 sins, is publish data without a supplementary paper. So now I tease the publisher, no, the paper should be supplementary to the data. So the paper describes for people how the data was created, blah, 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 blah. But most of how that was created and which machine can only be done also in the FAIR metadata, but you still need a supplementary paper. That can be peer reviewed. So when we published the Phantom 5 paper with 94,000 transcription start size, that's 16 million nano publications. Nobody's going to read through 16 million nano publications, of course. So only in reusing that data set by others and citing it, you will see, oh, this is a very useful data set. So FAIR, because it has a unique identifier for the data set, it has an accessibility license. You can say, if you reuse my data, you have to cite me. Now your data get a citation score. And that's much more important than the stupid journal impact factor. factor, of course. So we have to kill the journal impact factor. We have to start to reward people for sharing their data and see how many other people have A, reused them, and B, made comments about them and say, well, this data is very good because I discovered this new disease based on this data.
And also ensure that we don't end up with a data impact factor, right?
Well, I mean, I'm not so much against impact factors or any measurement of science. Of course, we could have a whole seminar on that. But the worst is the journal impact factor, because I have several Nature papers, and the FAIR paper has now been collecting 1,100 citations in 2 years. But I have one Nature paper that still has 2 citations after 20 years. And, you know, it still counts for a Nature paper on my CV, which is totally crazy. You know?
Yeah.
You should measure impact. And an impact factor should measure impact. And 90% of the social sciences articles are never cited.
Yep. I'm going to come straight into some social science related issues. The first one is you spoke of concepts and how they're assigned a unique identifier based on words. Now, you can follow the logic through there. If we have different cultures and different languages, which we do in global science, how does that affect these concepts? How do we know we're talking about the same things?
So we don't. So I always love to take the love example. I think there is 7 words in Spanish and 1 in Dutch, which tells you a little bit about, you know, the nature of the people. And of course, in Greek, there's the very famous theological problem that there is 4 words for love. You know, eros, philia, agape, that was even invented when Jesus came on the scene, because it didn't even exist in Greek. So there is this famous book of C.S. Lewis, The 4 Loves. So the big question is, if we now have 800 ontologies that refer to the concept water, for example, are we going to have 800 slightly different concepts because a farmer will look to water in a different way than somebody from the sea data cloud? So that comes back to the qua thing that I showed you. You can see semantic drift, near sameness. So what we now are striving at is one concept water. But since all the cardinal assertions in the knowledge of the concept water have a source and provenance, you can filter out how people looked at water 5 years ago, how farmers look at water, because that's what they say about water, how sea data cloud people talk about, and take love, or so you can deal with semantic drift and all these things. So a concept is always fuzzy at the edges. What do you still call a cow? Is a wildebeest in Africa still a cow? Well, from a biological standpoint, it's the same order. So by choosing your lens, you can now deal with near sameness, with semantic drift, with qua. And this is the step to artificial intelligence. Because the machine is just stupidly doing some machine learning on static graphs. So we have to move from static knowledge graphs that do not represent reality to dynamic graphs that are free-floating knowledge that overlap and move in conceptual space. And if you filter out certain sub-aspects of a knowledge, of a concept, it will move in conceptual space and probably suddenly have a new pattern. So that is in the eye of the beholder.
There's one question I have to ask. I see time is running on us. How does this apply to the humanities and social sciences? And to what extent can I and do I need to make my data fair in the humanities and social sciences?
You do. Actually, Arie Baak, a good friend of mine who runs this Eurodoc company that did these knowledge for diabetes that I showed. So he has 3 academic titles, and one of them is theology. So he's a theologist. And he wanted to make the knowledge of the concept God, but base it entirely on Vedic literature, then one on Judaic and Christian literature, Old Testament, New Testament, and Islam. And then his thesis would be whether, if we say God or Allah or whatever, we are actually talking about the same concept or not. And I tell you that his promoter said, Arie, I'm not going to supervise you because this will either cause the Third World War or maybe prevent it. But this is very dangerous stuff. So especially in the social sciences and the humanities, conceptual drift and slight differences between how do you look at Hitler or Jesus or whatever is going to be extremely important. And if you look at the analysis of Wikipedia, and you simply look at the map of how many edits are taking place per page, you know that there is two big peaks. And if you look at them, it's Jesus versus Hitler. Those are still today the most edited pages, because everyone has a different opinion about them. So the ultimate bad and the ultimate good, so to say. So especially in those sciences where we have vague concepts and different opinions about concepts, which is much more true for the social sciences than very exact sciences like mine, although there is lots of controversy also in biology, that's where the knowledge come in, because they allow this flexibility of looking at it. But if you don't make your stuff machine readable, you're lost, because you can say anything and then you are vague. And we know that some social sciences love that, because that's the only way they get stuff published, because they are vague enough for anyone to say anything. But I think if you want to do reproducible science in any way in the social sciences, and come back to Huub Stapel, psychiatrist, psychologist, he made up all this crazy stuff and people bought it and they published it in Nature, and none of the reviewers saw it because it was all quite logical, but it was all complete crazy stuff, and the machine would have told you years ago this is very unlikely.
Just before I wrap up, we had one comment. It was basically a comment. In machines we trust, but I still print off my photos because I don't want to lose them.
You know, let me say this. Never trust a machine. Never. Always check. And that's why we need provenance. And that's why if I would be certifying a machine learning algorithm and putting up the schema for certification, my first criterion would be it cannot be a black box. So even the machine, when it makes a reasoning and comes out with a hypothesis, should store the provenance of the entire trail. How did it come to this conclusion? But the alternative to this nice thing in machines we do not trust is something that George Strawn, my big guru, said in passing recently. He said, of course, everybody now knows machines are where the action is. And I like that. So in open science, machines are where the action is, because there is no way to do open science with massive amounts of data, also in the humanities, without the machine as our major research assistant. And in 10 years, they will be our boss. That's another story. But, you know, if you read Homo Deus, but, you know, for now, never trust a machine. What machines is where the action is. So better may know, make sure that the machine knows what you mean.
I'm going to take that as your closing statement, Barend, and I'm going to say thank you a lot for doing this. Thank you for all the answering all the questions. We have a lot more for you, I think. I'm also going to say thank you to Ivo Grigorev and also Roberta Moscon, who are on the front end, transferring all the questions and moderating on the YouTube Live channel. I can say already thanks from our ambassadors. There's a lot of comments coming in there.
Okay.
And maybe the final thing I'll say for our ambassadors is, while the next webinar number 4 is on open peer review with John Tennant, webinar number 6 is on data management with Paula Mazzuso, and she's going to go into depth in practical examples of researchers actually making their data open and fair. So we're going to develop on what Barend has basically talked to us.
One final thing then.
Yeah.
I am so motivated on the basic idea of young ambassadors for open science. That's, you know, science progresses one funeral at a time. We have to knock the silverbacks off their rocks. And I'm a silverback myself, so I can say it. But so if there's more questions, you can just send them to me. I'll answer them by mail or in any chat boxes or whatever. And if I need to do this again, if it leads to a big army of people that change science, I'm your man.
We're going to take you up on that, Barend.
Okay.
So thank you again. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
We see you all soon.